Hi, I'm Ian McIntyre. In this presentation I'm going to provide a short history of anti-arms fair protests in Australia, primarily focusing on those which occurred from 1986 to 2008, as well as touching on 2021's Disrupt Land Forces protest. Each protest occurred in a different context and experienced differing levels of success. One key similarity in strength, however, was that in each case campaigners chose to go beyond the networks and movements they primarily identified with to build coalitions. The enormous waste of resources associated with arms manufacture and the uses to which weapons are put in facilitating the exploitation, repression and destruction of people and places means that the associated issues range far and wide. Clearly, the promoters of arms fairs believe that bringing manufacturers and weapons dealers together in one place at one time has the potential to normalise and build the weapons industry, as well as to make them, as the organisers, a lot of money. On the other hand, the holding of high-profile arms fairs has had a long history of backfiring, as they can serve as a unifying target with the potential to mobilise a wide range of opponents. The issue of arms fairs in Australia first came up in 1986 when Deseco Proprietary Limited tried to hold the Pacific Area Defence Exhibition, or PADEX. This was billed as, quote, the first ever exhibition of global defence equipment in the Southern Hemisphere, and was promised to be one of the largest exhibitions of its type in the world. PADEX initially attracted interest from over 100 potential exhibitors hailing from 15 different countries. A number of campaign against PADEX coalitions sprang up around Australia, bringing together religious, union, peace, solidarity and environmental campaigners. They were told by political insiders and others that they didn't have a hope of stopping such an arms fair. However, although the peace movement was beginning to wane from its recent peak, the coalition nevertheless was able to draw on networks and sentiment, which in recent years had seen anti-nuclear rallies bring hundreds of thousands of Australians into the streets. The Nuclear Disarmament Party had won over 7% of the national vote in 1984. These achievements were, in turn, linked to over a decade of protests against uranium, US military bases and US warship visits. And further power was drawn from the fact that 1986 was the UN's International Year of Peace. Framing their campaign around the International Year, the coalition was able to convince the Australian Council of Trade Unions to place industrial bans against the arms fair. This forced the event to be moved from Sydney to Darwin. It was subsequently abandoned as the Federal Australian Labor Party government, under great pressure, eventually refused to lend its support. Deseco did not give up, however. Following the PADEX debacle, the company drafted in former National Return Services League President Sir William Keys. Using his connections, they launched a new event, the Australian International Defence Equipment Exhibition, or ADEX. By this time the peace movement was in decline, and the federal government had released its 1987 Defence White Paper calling for a dramatic increase in military spending. With the Hawke government eyeing arms exports as a way to offset the cost of importing new weapons, the government lent much support to the ADEX 89 event. Held in Canberra, it eventually saw 214 companies, governments and official bodies from 14 countries take part. Opposition to ADEX came in a variety of forms. Following a series of debates over appropriate tactics, the Stop ADEX campaign worked towards organising a blockade. Whilst the 1989 protests were unable to majorly disrupt the arms fair, they succeeded in drawing attention to the issue. And off the back of this came 2 years of frenetic campaigning. This came in the context of many new activists being mobilised and older ones re-energised through protests against the Gulf War, which was the first conflict the Australian government had officially been involved in since Vietnam. The Dili massacre in East Timor and the ongoing war in Bougainville, both of which involved forces using Australian-made military material, further intensified a focus on the arms industry. And a series of recent forest blockades had demonstrated the ability of disruptive action to shut down destructive activities. Tapping into this upswell, the Stop ADEX campaign branched out significantly in 1990 to include supporters in every state. Regular protests were held outside arms companies and state ministries, and an enormous lobbying and education campaign was run by a myriad of churches, unions and social justice organisations. Various union bodies passed resolutions against the arms fair, whilst the Australian Capital Territories Trades and Labour Council endorsed a picket line of the site and provided numerous resources. A women's telephone link-up was also organised across all the states of Australia, allowing feminist networks to share information and organise for a women's action in Canberra. With the national campaign gaining momentum, July 1991 saw an initial victory for the campaigners, as the ACT's government moved to cancel DeSico's booking at the National Exhibition Showgrounds. After DeSico threatened to sue for breach of contract, the ALP-led minority government backed off from a full cancellation, but held firm in passing a motion to, quote, endorse the principle that the Australian Capital Territory should not be used for promoting the international arms trade. With this in place, it was made clear to DeSico that ADEX would not be held again on Territory government property. Thanks to all this, campaigners went into ADEX 91 with the wind at their back. Securing a campsite directly across the road from the exhibition site gave them an extra advantage, as protesters could literally wake up, roll out of bed and start blockading. Indeed, they quickly got a jump on DeSico by turning up a week before ADEX 91 was officially to begin. Picketing of the site kicked off early and mushroomed into a major blockade involving up to 2,000 people and closing off all entrances. Groups congregated at and occupied different entrance points based on their political beliefs and tactical preferences. Those adhering to strict non-violent action principles blocked one gate with their bodies and star pickets. They engaged in dialogue with the police and checked that horse floats and vehicles coming in and out of an equestrian show were not being used to sneak in ADEX-related equipment. Another gate at the other end of the exhibition site saw a different set of activists build barricades, which were later set alight, out of car bodies, pickets and barbed wire. Literally occupying the middle ground between these two gates, another set of protesters combined the use of tripods, parked vehicles and physical picketing to further deny DeSico the use of the showgrounds. At points, police cut through fences to get equipment in, and with kilometres of fencing to defend, some protesters kept on the lookout, wandering from gate to gate. Unprepared for such a large and determined blockade, and with DeSico unable to get their displays on site, police repression increased. Canberra's paramilitary operations support group were brought in and paraded before protesters with shields and batons, whilst members of the Australian Federal Police were also drafted in from across the country. In response to the rising level of police violence, the majority of protesters remained non-violent, using humour, such as singing Monty Python's Always Look on the Bright Side of Life, to relieve tensions. The police eventually launched a huge operation, taking over 180 protesters into custody. This allowed the arms fair organisers to finally get their equipment into the site, but they now had less than 24 hours to set up. Faced with ongoing protests, some exhibitors pulled out and a number of ticket holders chose not to attend. The ADEX 91 protest dominated national TV news reports and newspaper headlines for over a week. The majority of these stories were negative towards the demonstrators, but authorities appeared to become concerned about how daily images of police attacking protesters might be perceived, even if they were couched by media outlets as being necessary to restore law and order. Towards the end of the protest, police allegations against the protesters became over the top, with false claims aired of protesters wielding acid-filled condoms and nail-studded avocados. Police paraded cooking knives, theatre props and similar items seized in a raid on the protest camp as evidence of violent intentions. Despite none of the police receiving wounds consistent with the use of such weapons, and no one being charged with their use or possession, the mainstream media largely reported these claims as fact. The divisions during the protest were echoed in debates that followed in its wake. While some hailed it as a victory and a return to militancy, which would be echoed in later demonstrations against George Bush Sr. and university fees, others felt that the negativity generated by the media and burnout associated with such a long and fraught campaign outweighed any gains. While the impact on the arms industry as a whole and outcomes for progressive movements were contested, in terms of the narrower goal of stopping ADEX, the blockade was undoubtedly a success. An attempt by DeSico to hold an ADEX 93 event in Canberra on Commonwealth land, outside of the ACT government's control, failed. The company then attempted to book a similar event in Queanbeyan under the title of Oztech, using a fairly flimsy argument that weapons would be just one of many forms of technology on display. Permission to use local council facilities was scuttled following intense lobbying from religious, peace and other groups. Ironically, the labelling of largely non-violent protesters as, quote, thugs and terrorists by DeSico was to serve the peace movement in the long run. Wherever the company went, they found that local and state authorities were unwilling to risk bringing such chaos to their town. For the next 17 years, the arms industry shied away from holding an event on the scale of ADEX. Instead, they chose to meet and display their wares behind the facade of air shows or away from public view in hotels and military installations. However, with the memory of ADEX fading, a new company emerged in 2007, announcing it would hold the Asia Pacific Defence and Security Exhibition at the Adelaide Convention Centre from November 11 the following year. The Arms Fair received a hearty endorsement as well as financial support from the State Australian Labor Party RAN administration, who, in the midst of a collapsing manufacturing sector, had been talking up South Australia as the defence state for some time. From late 2007, peace groups began lobbying against the Arms Fair, and by the middle of 2008, coalitions of peace, environmental, solidarity and other groups in Adelaide, Sydney and Melbourne had begun to coalesce around the aim of planning a blockade for November. By choosing to open the exhibition on the 90th anniversary of the ending of World War I, Arms Fair organisers have once again handed their opponents an important public relations advantage. Nevertheless, due to the peace movement experiencing a lull, and taking into consideration other factors to do with the timing and location of the Arms Fair, many campaigners doubted they would be able to draw the numbers needed to shut the event down. Some, however, believed that a disruptive protest could be used to draw public attention and provide a base to build on, in the way that ADEX 89 had. With the anti-Arms Fair campaign gaining momentum, the shock announcement came in early September 2008 that the Arms Fair would be cancelled due to security concerns. As in 1991, the demonisation of protesters immediately came to the fore, with the South Australian Deputy Premier claiming that the decision was made due to expectations that, quote, feral low-life people that want society to be in a state of near anarchy for their own perverse pleasure would be descending on Adelaide. In spite of the predictable statements about evil protesters, it soon became evident that the projected costs of policing had been the determining factor in the cancellation. The South Australian Police had advised the government in previous days that they would require 500 officers for the protest and that annual leave would have to be cancelled for the entire force. This will cost far more than the government was willing to pay for an event, which already had the potential to reflect badly upon them. The role of political and financial costs was further reinforced by Arms Fair organisers after they admitted that the Commonwealth Government and the Department of Defence had failed to get behind the project, further undermining its viability. Once more, the political and economic costs of holding an arms fair had been shown to outweigh the potential profits, and the peace movement took heart in a rare victory. The weapons industry once again returned to low-profile gatherings and the use of air shows. And it would be another 13 years before a new large-scale event, the International Land Defence Exposition, aka Land Forces, was held in Australia, this time in Brisbane in 2021. Despite occurring in the midst of a pandemic, with lockdowns taking place in other parts of the country, this too was opposed by a coalition, which, under the banner of Disrupt Land Forces, brought together 300 people to engage in 7 days of protest. Equipment was occupied before and during the Arms Fair, and a launch held involving solidarity fires being lit in Musgrave Park and the highlands of West Papua. Noisy and creative protests plagued local arms firms and the expo, all of which resulted in community building, 37 arrests and much media coverage. To learn more about the history of Australian campaigns against arms fairs, visit these pages at commonslibrary.org. One includes a book, radio documentary and video about protests up until 2008, and the other is a report which reflects on the events and lessons of the 2021 Disrupt Land Forces protest. Thanks to Jules, Leo Build and Wage Peace for providing the images used in this presentation.